Okay, people, this is the first of at least 2 or 3 nervous system slideshows. I've linked some other slideshows on the playlist page at the YouTube channel that was created for me by GRCC. That has some really good videos, really good stuff. I keep sending you to those. But of course I have to, I need to bring you through this process of, and in your book this is going to be chapter 12. So this is the nervous system basics, starting off. So, let's move forward. Oh, I lost my pen. There's my pen. Okay, so the nervous system. What is the nervous system? The nervous system is a specialized cellular system, and the nerves of the body. And you have a fair idea of what nerves do, but we have to get to the nuts and bolts, the deeper issues of what nerve cells do. So here's a definition. The nervous system interprets and responds to information, right? The information comes in various sources. We're going to talk about how that gets into your body. But your brain and your spinal cord and your nervous system have to figure out what's happening outside of you, and then how should you respond to whatever is happening outside of you, but also responding to things that are happening inside of you as well. Right, so here we go. Detects changes, makes decisions, stimulates muscles and glands to respond, and maintains homeostasis. Oh my gosh, how many times have you heard me say that? Maintain homeostasis, so critical. So, you have 2 big nerve, or neural tissues, I guess I should say. Neural tissues come in 2 big types, and these are the big types. You have neurons. Neurons are the, where the action's at, and those are the things that you're used to thinking about, talking about. Nerve cells. Those are the ones that send signals and receive signals and all that. Okay. But neurons cannot do all of this stuff by themselves. They have to have supporting cells, supporting tissues, helper cells. Those helper cells are called neuroglia. So all of them, and there's all kinds of different cells that are lumped into this category called neuroglia. And they do all these things. They surround and they support neurons. I mean, literally support them physically, but also support them metabolically. They nourish neurons. They send and receive messages, but not in the same way that neurons do. It's a little different. We'll get to that. And then they help maintain the blood-brain barrier. And you may have heard the blood-brain barrier is a very difficult to penetrate barrier that keeps your brain and spinal cord, your central nervous system, separated from the rest of the body. And rightly so. So, the divisions of the nervous system. You have 2 big divisions of the nervous system. What we call the central nervous system. That includes the brain and the spinal cord. That's it. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the brain and the spinal cord, but that's it. The brain and spinal cord. That's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. Anything that is not directly associated with the central nervous system is associated with the peripheral nervous system, PNS. That includes cranial nerves, as you see, and spinal nerves. We'll get to what spinal nerves are. But cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and I would also say ganglia. These tissues, or these you'll see. We'll talk about what ganglia are. But that's the other part of the peripheral nervous system that is not a part of the central nervous system, are these things called ganglia. So here are the divisions in picture form. Right, you have the brain. Now, brain is considered part of the central nervous system. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. Over here on the other side, you have cranial nerves. They are a part of the peripheral nervous system. Even though they're up near the brain, they're still considered part of the peripheral nervous system. And spinal nerves are certainly peripheral nervous system. Right, so here's the central nervous system right here. Central. CNS. Brain, spinal cord. Boom, done. Peripheral nervous system is broken down into 2 parts. You have the sensory receptors. That just means anything, your eyes, your nose, taste buds, your ears, touch sensors, joint position sensors, muscle position sensors, all of those things. All those are sensors. They're considered part of the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. So they give input into the brain and spinal cord. And then your brain and spinal cord have to figure out, what do I do with that information? What am I going to do with that? How am I going to respond to that? The response comes from what's called the motor division. So sensory receptors give input into the central nervous system. The motor division is the doer, the activator of whatever response that the central nervous system has decided it needs to have. Motor division of the peripheral nervous system can be broken down into what we call the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Somatic means skeletal muscle. So if you're going to have a response that involves moving bones around, and you just went through this in chapter 10, how skeletal muscle works. This is where the nervous sensation, or the nervous report, the nervous activity comes from the somatic nervous system, tells skeletal muscle what to do. The autonomic nervous system integrates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands of your body. Those functions that you don't have to think about, they just happen automatically in response to some sort of input into the central nervous system. So, brief review: central nervous system, brain, spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, cranial nerves, and spinal nerves. Peripheral nervous system broken down: sensory receptors bring input into the brain and spinal cord. Motor division sends signals out to the body to do something with that information. Alright, here's the functions. So, we break it down. Sensory, the sensory function. The nervous system receives information in various forms. Those sensory receptors gather information and detect changes. So there has to be some sort of change out there in the real world, the outside world, such that your nerves are sensitive to that. They respond to it. They send a signal back to your brain and spinal cord, and your brain and spinal cord have to now take that, and they have the integrative function, right? This thing here, integrative function, means what is that signal? What's the sense? What's going on? Your nervous system coordinates sensory information to create sensations, memories, and thoughts. The nervous system then makes decisions based on the body's response to sensory information, right? You take the information in, your brain and spinal cord figure out what to do, then the motor function takes it out. And the motor division does what the central nervous system tells it to do. So, anything that's associated with the sensory nervous system is called an affector. That starts with an A, okay? I'm going to just write the A, because down here, the motor function, the doers, muscles or glands, are effectors with an E on it, okay? So get that difference. Up here, affectors, same following letters. This is the affective system. This is the effective system. We're going to get more into that. You'll see. The divisions of the portion of the motor peripheral nervous system, you saw this on the previous slide. There's the somatic nervous system, transmits voluntary instructions to skeletal muscles. You might not always think of it as voluntary, but that's how we break it down. The autonomic nervous system transmits involuntary instructions from the central nervous system to smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. And they do what the nerves tell them to do. Alright, now we got to talk about nerve cells. So now we're talking about neurons. We're not talking about neuroglia here. That's the other kind of cell. Neurons. These are the cells that you know, that you have heard about and understand, and they send electrical impulses through the cell itself. So neurons can come in various shapes and sizes. They may differ in length and size in their axons and dendrites. Neurons share certain features. They have a cell body. That's a soma. The cell body has the nucleus, has the nucleus, has cytoplasm, organelles, neurofilaments, chromatophilic substance, which is called a Nissl body. It's this black little tiny specks inside the cell body. Dendrites are branch receptive surfaces. A neuron may have many, many dendrites. A dendrite receives information. It's the receiver of whatever information is going to come into that nerve cell. And then an axon distributes that information. It transmits. So a dendrite receives information. An axon transmits an impulse and then releases a neurotransmitter to another neuron or effector. When we ever say effector, an effector, it has an effect. It can be another neuron, it can be a muscle, cell, it can be a gland. Okay? You've already been through this though. You know that motor neurons have a synapse on the sarcolemma, the outside of a muscle cell. It is transmitting an impulse. It releases a neurotransmitter. Remember what that neurotransmitter is? Acetylcholine. That neurotransmitter tells the muscle cell to contract. You've already been through this. You already know. You're ahead of the game here. You get what an axon is, what an axon does, and that the effect that an axon has on a muscle cell, at least. It can also transmit information to the next neuron down the chain. Here it is, the picture. Okay, so you have dendrites. Dendrites are out here. These are dendrites. Dendrite there, dendrite there, dendrite. All of these are dendrites. Lots and lots and lots of dendrites. Most nerve cells have lots and lots of dendrites. This is information coming in from usually other nerves. Could be a receptor in your skin. There's lots of different inputs, but a dendrite is going to bring information in. Here is the cell body. This whole thing here is the cell body. All right? That has neurofilaments in it. Has chromatophilic substance, what are called Nissl bodies. These black dots, well, they're not so black in this picture, but these darkened dots, those are Nissl bodies, Nissl, or chromatophilic substances. All right, dendrites and axons. So you see the dendrites bring information in, and here's the axon that takes that action potential out to wherever it's going. You saw this so you can think back to chapter 10. You think of muscles. So that action potential comes down. An axon can have several different endings on it. There's not just one ending on one axon. You can have a tree branch of axonal endpoints, or synaptic bulbs. So this one has one, here and here, and there's a whole bunch of them, right? So all of these are outputs. Dendrites are inputs. Axon is output. There's an axon terminal. I've circled the axon terminal here. And then there's a synaptic knob. Right at the end is where it will make a synapse with the next cell down the road. Here's something you haven't seen yet. Myelin. Myelin is a fatty substance that surrounds an axon. It provides insulation, but it also speeds up the rate of transmission. Axons have myelin around them, often, not everyone, but axons will have myelin around them. Dendrites do not. Let me repeat that. Axons will have, if they have myelin, the myelin will be on the axon and not on the dendrite. This is called a myelin sheath. Even though it's not continuous sheath, right? Here's a part of it there, that's myelin, and here's myelin, this yellowy stuff, right? And here's a little segment of myelin. All of that is called a myelin sheath, or we say this axon is myelinated. We're going to talk about what makes myelin and what it's good for. So we'll get to that. All right, here we are, myelination. So this process of myelination of axons, get that straight. Not dendrites, axons. Right, so in the peripheral nervous system, this thing here, the PNS, neuroglia, right, those are the non-neurons. So the neuroglia that makes an axon, makes a myelin sheath, not an axon, it makes a myelin sheath. So this myelin sheath is made by this special kind of neuroglia cell called a Schwann cell. That is in the peripheral nervous system. There is a different cell that makes the same kind of myelin covering in the central nervous system. We'll get to that in a bit. In the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells make the myelin sheath. Right? Schwann cells wrap tightly around axons in layers and layers and layers composed of myelin. And a myelin is a lipoprotein, or it's a fatty substance. It's an insulator. It's like, the cables, the electrical cables that run from one utility pole to the next utility pole. They're covered in plastic. Well, here, your axon is covered in myelin. So it's an insulator. Right? So coating is called a myelin sheath. You can see it's wrapped around and around. The myelin sheath is wrapped around and around and around and around. So you have many, many, many concentric layers right here. Lots of concentric layers of a myelin sheath. Now in between, here's a Schwann. This is one Schwann cell that has composed this myelin sheath. And now that same Schwann cell, or maybe a different Schwann cell, doesn't really matter, will compose this myelin sheath. Right, so you've got that myelin sheath there, this myelin sheath here. It could be the same Schwann cell that forms the myelin sheath at each of these places. Or it could be a separate Schwann cell. Doesn't really matter. They wrap around, 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 around. But then they have these gaps. This is the important thing. The gap. That gap is called the node of Ranvier. One of my favorite physiologic terms, because I don't speak French, but I like to pretend I do. Nodes of Ranvier. These are the gaps in between the myelin sheath between Schwann cells. Okay, so that gap right there is called a node of Ranvier. Very, very important concept that you understand that. So here's the sheath, myelin sheath, a gap, myelin sheath, a gap, myelin sheath, a gap, on and on and on, all the way down the axon. Now, this is an important concept. Not all axons are myelinated. Lots of them are, but not all of them. But those that are myelinated axons in the peripheral nervous system have a series of Schwann cells lined up along the axon, each having wrapped a coating of myelin insulating the axon. Now this is a cross-section, right? So here is the axon. That's the axon right there. This is the myelin sheath, and if you could, if we could get you in to a closer microscopic view, you would see there's just layer upon layer, around, this layer goes. And all that stuff is the myelin sheath, right? Creates an insulation. But not all of them do. Unmyelinated axons are encased by a Schwann cell and cytoplasm, but there's no myelin wrapping around the axon. So they give you an example of that down here. Here is another axon, and it has a Schwann cell. This whole thing here is a Schwann cell, this red area that I'm drawing in. But it did not wrap that axon. For whatever reason, what myelination does, it's an insulating layer. It allows this axon, the myelinated axon, will transmit at a faster rate, a faster pace. The nervous impulse will travel along that nerve faster than this one. An unmyelinated axon transmits its signal slower. That's what myelin gets for you. Faster transmission with a myelinated axon, slower transmission with unmyelinated. Now, we have to classify nerve cells. Now, this is how we classify neurons, okay? Not neuroglia. These are neurons. Neurons come in various shapes and sizes, all right? This one is called a multipolar. Multipolar refers to there's a dendrite and a dendrite and a dendrite, lots of dendrites. We call these poles, okay? So that's multipolar. Multipolar means lots of dendrites and then one axon. And you see the direction of impulse is always, always, always in this direction. Oopsie. Always in that direction. from dendrites through dendrites to axon. It's not always through the cell body. You're going to see that in a minute. This is called a multipolar neuron. Look at that, 99%. 99% of neurons all through your body are multipolar. All right, here's a second type, a bipolar neuron. No, it's not. It doesn't have a anxiety disorder, or it's not bipolar in the psychological sense. It has nothing to do with that. This is bipolar in the sense that this is one pole, so the dendrites occupy one side, then the cell body's in the middle, and then the other pole is considered this axon. So we consider that bipolar. One pole here, the other pole is there, so we call that bipolar. Last kind is called a unipolar. Unipolar means the cell body has a little segment that comes out of it, and then it forms a T. And the part that we would normally say are, well, these are still dendrites, so these are still receiving information. So these things here are dendrites. They're receiving information. Information in, information travels this direction again, as you're used to, dendrites, and then out the axon. Now these are called unipolar, right? One process cell bodies are in the ganglia. So these things, these cell bodies, this thing circled in red there, that's a cell body, right? This has a cell body here. This is a cell body here. You know that already. That cell body in a unipolar neuron is going to be in a ganglia. Now a ganglia is a big conglomeration of cell bodies. We're going to see pictures of that in a minute. Unipolar neurons are almost always sensory. Multipolar neurons tend to be, hold on, people. There's some sort of emergency signal going on. Yikes. Okay. I just received the message that we have 6 more weeks of winter from Governor Whitmer. No, not winter. That's, of course, that's Punxsutawney Phil and seeing a shadow and all that stuff. Anyway, we're supposed to stay home for many more weeks. So, let's continue this lecture. On we go. Oops. Okay. Again, classification of neurons. We've already seen this now, right? We have sensory neurons. You saw this in another slide. They're sensory neurons, right? They're called afferent. Afferent means they're bringing impulses into the central nervous system. Most sensory neurons are unipolar. There's a few that are bipolar. But most of them are unipolar or bipolar, okay? They are not multipolar. They are unipolar or bipolar. They're carrying information. So here's a sensory receptor. This could be your eye. This could be your fingertip. It could be your ear. It could be, anything, any sensation that you can imagine. That sensation causes this sensory neuron to send information into the central nervous system. Now you have an inner neuron. An inner neuron is going to be in the central nervous system. An inner neuron will take input from usually from other peripheral nerves, and lots of peripheral nerves. So there's lots and lots of peripheral nerves that are sending signals to this inner neuron, and then the inner neuron is making a decision on whether, should I send an impulse to the next neuron? Yes, I should. If it sends this impulse, inner neurons continue to transfer that information from one part of the central nervous system to the other. So all along the way, these neurons are making decisions about, not making decisions like you tend to think of making decisions, but they make decisions about, should I pass the signal on? Where should I send that signal? So these decisions are being made by all of these nerves. All right, so inner neurons, they're also called association neurons. They link one neuron to another neuron. They're always multipolar. Inner neurons are always multipolar. Remember, sensory neurons are usually unipolar. They're sometimes bipolar. Inner neurons are always located in the central nervous system. Sensory neurons are in the peripheral nervous system. Now, your central nervous system makes decisions. Eventually it says, yes, I want to do something to that motor neuron. Send that signal out. The motor neuron starts in the central nervous system and then heads out to the peripheral nervous system. And it tells whatever its effector cell, muscle, gland, right? So they're multipolar. And they are efferent. Afferent means signals into the central nervous system. Efferent means signals out from the central nervous system. They carry impulses away from the central nervous system. They carry impulses to effectors. Effectors do something. So that's the path of information. Sensory information comes in from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Interneurons figure out what to do. They send signals out to a motor neuron that tells an effector what to do with that information. Now, I told you there are neurons. We just went through what neurons do. Neuroglia are the support cells. They're the behind-the-scenes cells. So the general functions provide structural support. In the embryo, they guide the neurons into position. So as you're developing a nervous system, the neuroglia are guiding, bringing those cells along to the right places, making the right connections. The neuroglia help that. They produce growth factors to nourish neurons and remove excess ions and neurotransmitters, and they aid in the formation of synapses. Synapses is how nerves talk to each other. So, if you're injured, if you bash your leg or your arm, you may damage nerves. If you damage nerves, sometimes they can regenerate, but they're going to need a little help. And they're going to need help from neuroglia. Right, so mature neurons don't divide. Now, there may be some changes in this, but as far as we care about for this class, they do not divide. So once a neuron is in place, if it is irreparably destroyed, it cannot regenerate itself. It cannot divide and make another neuron. This is very different than your epithelium, right? Your epithelium is dividing all the time. You're constantly creating new skin, but you are not creating new neurons. Right? So if a cell body is injured, if the cell body is injured, the neuron usually dies. The cell body, and that makes sense. You damage the cell body, that's DNA. If you're going to damage how that cell metabolizes nutrients or how it stays alive, you can't regenerate that. So if the cell body is damaged, the neuron dies. So how do neurons regenerate if they can? So in the peripheral nervous system, all right, if a peripheral axon is injured, it may regenerate. Okay? If the axon is separated from the cell body and its myelin sheath will degenerate. So if you were to say cut a cell, there are different kinds of injuries. If you crush an axon, but don't separate it from the cell body, you've got a pretty good chance of that axon regenerating. If it's cut, literally sliced through, there is much less of a chance. It's possible, but it's much less of a chance. So we say if the axon is separated from the cell body, the myelin sheath degenerates. It's difficult for that axon to repair. It's possible still. Now, the Schwann cells are still there, and the neurolemma. The neurolemma is the cell membrane around a neuron. The remaining Schwann cells provide guiding sheath for a growing axon. So sometimes, even though the myelin sheath is degenerated, the axon will still regrow from the cell body on out. The Schwann cells guide that new axon growth because they're still there. They're still in place. They didn't get damaged, or, well, they may have gotten damaged, but they didn't get destroyed. If those cells are still there, the Schwann cells will guide this new axon, and then, of course, they will cover it with myelin. If the growing axon establishes a former connection, the function will return. All right, so if you crush a nerve, a big tree falls in the forest and lands on your leg, and it crushes some nerves in your calf. and you can't walk because you can't move your foot or your ankle. Over time, the axon may regenerate, it may remyelinate, it may connect back to the muscles that it was originally connected to, and it may work. Then you can regain the function that you lost after the tree smashed your calf. If the damage is too extensive, the function may be lost. Now, in the central nervous system, so that's the peripheral nervous system, okay? In the central nervous system, things are a little sketchier. Right? The CNS axons lack a neural lemma, so they have a different kind of outer membrane. Oligodendrocytes do not proliferate after injury. So I haven't talked to you about this. Oligodendrocytes do exactly the same thing that Schwann cells do, except oligodendrocytes are associated with the central nervous system. Schwann cells are associated with the peripheral nervous system. They create a myelin sheath. Both cell types make myelin sheaths. Unfortunately, oligodendrocytes do not proliferate after an injury like Schwann cells do. Schwann cells do proliferate after an injury. Oligodendrocytes don't. So remyelination is pretty unlikely. So regeneration is unlikely. So if you damage the central nervous system, it's likely to have permanent damage. Much more likely to have permanent damage than the peripheral nervous system. Now, this is the huge important thing. But you already know what a synapse is. You've seen it with skeletal muscle. Right? The motor neuron ends in a synaptic bulb, this thing here, end of the axon. It's called a synaptic bulb. And the space in between the synaptic bulb and the next tissue down the line is called the synapse. The synapse is the gap itself. All right, so if I were to draw that, I would draw, a bulb here, and I would draw that out. And then I would say, well, here's the next cell, and I'll just make it look like the same thing. Okay, the signal's coming down this way. That gap, that is the synapse. The gap itself is the synapse. It is the literal space between two nerve cells, or between, you've seen this in motor neurons, the space between the synaptic bulb and the sarcolemma. So the space is called the synapse. That means anything before the synapse is pre-synaptic, and anything after the synapse is post-synaptic. And that's what they're saying here. All right? So presynaptic means that's the thing that's sending the signal. Presynaptic here. Then there's the gap, and then over here, over on this side, is postsynaptic. So now the signal continues on down, if it's going to continue. That is everything after the synapse is postsynaptic. So presynaptic before it, postsynaptic after the synapse. The synaptic cleft separates the two neurons. This is a literal gap. The gap itself is about on the order of 20 nanometers. Maybe 20 to 30 nanometers. It's not much, but it's a gap. All right, so they show you. So here is an axon. It's myelinated. It's bringing a signal into the next cell's dendrite. Here is the synapse. So we would say that this cell, this axon is presynaptic. Then we would say that all of this cell, all of that is postsynaptic. So that's the postsynaptic neuron. This thing's the presynaptic neuron. Here's another presynaptic neuron down here. It's coming in, it's myelinated, it's sending a signal to this nerve cell. Here is the axon of the postsynaptic neuron. So if a signal is going to get sent out, it's going to get sent out this way on that axon. All right? So here's the general way it works. Here's the cell body, the axon, the signal is going in this direction. It reaches the synapse. If it's going to keep on going, and there are reasons that it wouldn't, but if it is going to keep on going, it's going to keep on going in the same direction. So we'd say this is presynaptic. This one is postsynaptic. Okay, you need to understand these terms because we're going to start to use them quite freely. All right, so synaptic transmission. Here's the direction of the impulse. Okay, it's heading this way. Neurotransmitters are inside vesicles, just like in a muscle, like you've seen this already. One-way transfer of information, one way. That's the power of a synapse. It keeps things flowing in one direction and one direction only. You've already seen this in muscles. Here's the vesicles that have neurotransmitter in them. Here's the vesicle using exocytosis to bind with the cell membrane here. It releases its neurotransmitter. Here's the neurotransmitter, a little blue dot. The neurotransmitter combines with its receptor, its specific receptor, on the postsynaptic membrane. Right, so the vesicles by exocytosis, the neurotransmitter will exert either an excitatory or an inhibitory. Yes, it doesn't always excite the next nerve cell down the road. Sometimes it inhibits the next nerve cell down the road. So the postsynaptic neuron may be inhibited or excited. You need to understand that concept. Okay, that's it for this. We're going to get into the next part in the next slideshow.